Welcome back, my name is Cole, and this is my More for Devlog series. This week I've been working on completely overhauling my game from scratch, and the first thing I needed to do was install the newest version of Unity 2019 and install any Android SDK or IndieGay packages. This step took a couple tries to get right. Then, because I had already amassed 5 years worth of art for my game, I worked on importing my old sprites into the new project and started designing my first few menu screens. Here was some brief concept art for what I wanted it to look like, but I was pretty liberal with how I interpreted it. I found it really straightforward to design because I was essentially creating from blueprints of previous versions of my game, and at this point I was very fluent in Unity systems. I made the choice to deliberately not program my own parallax system, which later comes into play with backgrounds and foreground images, mainly because at this point I know exactly how I want to make my game using Unity's systems, and I really don't want to program my own system. Using Unity's built-in perspective camera system is just a whole loads easier. Then I created some art for unlocking sectors, which I'll show off in the next video. It's actually a really cool mechanic, and I'm really happy with how it's turned out. Finally, I made some finishing touches on the sector preview screens before finishing my menu and adding level select screens. It was now time to start making the actual game. With the release of Unity 2018, we saw the implementation of the sprite shape feature as well as 2D lighting and just a whole host of 2D support. In all honesty, just the 2D lighting and this general overhaul was more than enough reason for me to restart my entire development process from scratch, and I'm really excited to be able to now utilize these features fully. It took a little finagling, but I managed to create platforms and put little decorations around them, and it's very fluid, and I just have to say it's going to increase my workflow dramatically. Then, I needed to program player input. Now, I had been dreading this, and it turned out that my IndieK folders didn't communicate with Unity properly, and so I spent an entire day trying to debug. It turns out that in Unity 2019.4, when Unity Hub downloads the JDK folders, the default address for the directory in the project settings tab directs to the wrong folder. It's one folder not deep enough. And so after hours of hassle, I made one change to the directory and... With player input working now, I could finally rest easy and start laying out the rest of the level. This is where Sprite Shape really came in to save me because I was able to fly through the entire level design process in just a matter of a couple hours. I got excited and started creating some new sprites that would further utilize the Sprite Shape features, specifically a pipe that the player can travel through. And after making sure that the lighting was accurate for each corner of the sprite sheet, I added my new pipe to the placeholder, and it worked like a charm. Next, I started drawing my tutorial images. I had always been a fan of the invisible tutorials in games, opting to use the player's intuition rather than explicitly telling the player how to play. The first graphic, I think it clearly indicates to the player that they have to tilt their phone in kind of an unobtrusive way, which then is immediately facilitated by a hill to encourage continued movement. At this point, I sort of got sidetracked because I was so excited to start testing out Unity's 2D lights, and so I jump-started my checkpoint system. Really just as an excuse to try out these new toys. I may have gone a little overboard adding 5 entire lights to just one object, but I dig how it looks, so I think I'm going to keep it. The entire overhaul has really allowed me some breathing room in terms of reevaluating the mechanics in my game, and namely the morph mechanic. Previously, players toggled between the two modes by tapping, and while I think opting not to have any buttons is a great choice, which is my biggest criticism of mobile platformers in general, This still felt clunky and hard to control, and most players didn't understand why they continued to jump, even after they let go of the screen. The concept of switching between modes, rather than just temporarily enabling one, really isn't an intuitive mechanic, and so I decided to entirely alter how the player activates modes. Now, I have a base state and an active state. In the base state, the player doesn't have to exert any extra command to move, and in Sector Alpha, this is the rolling mode. Then, to activate the jumping mode, the player now has to hold down the screen rather than just tapping it. And I feel like this is much more akin to pressing the jump button in a game like Super Mario Bros. And it offers extensive control over the player's jump arc. The player now has the ability to low jump, and holding down the screen for multiple jumps in a row makes way more sense now. This also opened up the opportunity for Coyote Time, which is essentially a tiny window just after the player leaves a platform in which they can still jump. All in all, I think this change will really enhance the overall experience by offering a greater level of precision to the player, and I think it will allow for some very interesting and unique puzzle elements later on. Lastly, I got to work on the pause menu and death mechanic. And while I enjoyed the instant respawn of previous versions, I thought showing the player a brief second of their character would be fun, and so I made a tiny particle effect occur as well. Now that I have the basic input mechanics out of the way, I'll show you the theory behind the level design. Initially, the player rolls out of this little door here with some forward momentum, followed directly by this slope. And hopefully this gets the player used to the idea of physics in the game, and so when the tutorial shows, they'll be ready to tilt their phone. People generally tilt their controllers when they play games, so this honestly should be fairly intuitive once players are told that that's what they need to do. Next, I place some increasing hills to teach the player that the further they tilt their phone, the faster they'll go. You can't see it right now because I'm using my keyboard for input, but I had issues where previous playtesters would just barely tilt their phone and then play the level in 5 agonizing minutes because they were moving so slow and they didn't know they could move faster. I also added a second graphic to remind the player to tilt and increase the tilt of the graphic shown. Next, the player enters zigzagging pipes. Because there is only one possible route to follow, the player is forced in an intuitive way to tilt both to the right and to the left. You'd be surprised at how foreign bidirectional movement seems to novice players, so I think this eases into the concept in a pretty straightforward manner. Finally, we introduce the tapping mechanic. Up until this point, touching the screen has no effect, and I think I'm going to actually make this graphic appear after a second or two instead of immediately, just to give the player a moment to realize that they can't get out of this pit just by rolling. I tried to emphasize the holding part of the mechanic in the graphic, but the player has to make a high jump in order to make it onto the next platform, so this really teaches a couple mechanics at once. Following this, I remind the player that they have to let go of the screen to return to the base morph mode, which really shouldn't be a problem, but again, novice players are really just unpredictable. I throw in another pipe just to encourage rolling through, and we have our first actual jump. I think Coyote Time will be extremely helpful in this particular situation because you've just come out of rolling from a hill. And the introduction of mechanics in safe ways where there's no consequence for not understanding it at first is really important when teaching something new to the player. Right after is a checkpoint, and the first real jump. It's difficult to clear these gaps with low jumps, but I've noticed novice players tend to do everything they can to give them an edge, like bumping their phone when they jump, or tilting upward, or swinging the entire phone up when they jump. So I have no doubt that they'll at least inadvertently hold the screen all the way until they've cleared the jump. I introduce floating platforms, again in a safe environment, and the idea of verticality. It may seem odd to have another checkpoint following this, and especially so close to the exit, but I really want the first level to just ease into the whole experience, and this last jump is the hardest in the level. 2 consecutive jumps must be made in a row, and one of them is onto a platform. In previous versions, I used to have 10 or so consecutive platforms, which really asked a lot of players, even skilled ones, and I feel this is far more fitting for an introductory level. The player lands on the platform, is greeted by the exit sign, and finishes the level. Anyway, that's about it for this level. If you want to support this project, please leave a like and subscribe. My Patreon is in the description, and I'll see you all next week.